The clock struck 1:30 in the morning on March 5, 2008, in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Inside a modest off-campus house, while most of the college town slept, Eve Carson sat at her desk, textbook spread before her, laptop glowing in the quiet darkness. Her roommates had just left for a late-night party, their laughter echoing briefly in the hallway before the front door clicked shut behind them. Eve had declined their invitation, choosing instead to stay home and study. It was a decision that would cost her everything. By sunrise, this brilliant young woman, a student body president, a scholarship recipient, a beacon of hope for her community, would be dead. Her body discovered on a desolate street, just 1 mile from her home. The investigation that followed would reveal a crime so senseless, so brutally random, that it would shake not just the University of North Carolina, but the entire nation. This is a chilling true story of how two strangers targeted an innocent student in her own home, setting off a chain of events that would expose the vulnerabilities in our most trusted spaces, and ultimately change how we think about campus safety forever. Before we dive deeper into this dark history, if you're fascinated by real crime documentaries and investigative stories like this one, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you these chilling true stories every week, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know where you're rewatching from tonight. Now, to understand the full impact of what happened to Eve Carson, we need to understand who she was and the world she inhabited in the spring of 2008. Chapel Hill in those days was considered one of the safest college towns in America. The University of North Carolina campus, with its iconic bell tower and tree-lined quads, represented everything that American higher education aspired to be. Students walked freely at all hours. Doors were often left unlocked, and the biggest safety concerns typically revolved around underage drinking or minor vandalism during basketball season. Eve Carson embodied the very best of this environment. Born on November 19, 1985, in Athens, Georgia, she had been exceptional from childhood, but exceptional in a way that seemed effortless, natural. The kind of person who made leadership look easy because she genuinely cared about others. During her high school years, while her peers were focused on social media and weekend parties, Eve was already demonstrating the kind of character that would define her short but impactful life. She served as vice president of her student council. But this wasn't just a resume builder. Eve threw herself into every responsibility, organizing blood drives, coordinating charity events, and creating mentorship programs for younger students. Her volunteer work at a local nursing home was uncourt-ordered community service. It was something she chose to do every week, spending hours listening to elderly residents, helping them write letters, and organizing activities to brighten their days. She also volunteered at a shelter for abused teenagers, work that exposed her to the harsh realities that some of her peers faced, and perhaps shaped her understanding of how fragile safety and security could be. Even more remarkably, Eve worked as a congressional page while still in high school, splitting her time between her studies and the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. Experience gave her a first-hand look at how policy was made, how democracy functioned at its highest levels, and it reinforced her belief that she could make a difference in the world. She also assisted in a stem cell research laboratory, contributing to cutting-edge medical research that could potentially save lives. All of this while maintaining the grades necessary to graduate with honors and earn admission to one of the nation's most prestigious public universities. When Eve arrived at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2004, she chose an ambitious academic path that reflected her diverse interests and her commitment to making a meaningful impact. She pursued a double major in political science and biology, a combination that positioned her perfectly for a career in public health policy, medical research, or healthcare administration. Her outstanding academic record earned her a prestigious scholarship, a recognition that meant everything to a middle-class family from Georgia. But Eve didn't just excel in her studies. She quickly became one of the most visible and beloved figures on campus. She joined numerous student organizations, not as a passive member collecting lines on her resume, but as someone who brought energy, ideas, and genuine enthusiasm to everything she touched. Her professors remember her as the student who always had thoughtful questions, who stayed after class to discuss complex policy implications, who seemed to understand intuitively how academic theory connected to real-world problems. Her commitment to service continued throughout her college years. She taught science at a local elementary school, spending her free afternoons helping children understand basic concepts about the natural world. Her approach was patient and creative. She had a gift for making complex ideas accessible, for sparking curiosity in young minds. The children adored her, and their teachers often remarked on how much more engaged the students became when Miss Eve was leading the lesson. Eve's international experiences further broadened her perspective on global issues. She spent a summer in Ecuador, working alongside doctors in rural clinics where resources were scarce and needs were overwhelming. This experience exposed her to healthcare challenges in developing nations, strengthening her resolve to pursue a career that could address global health disparities. She studied abroad for a semester in Cuba, immersing herself in a completely different political and economic system, learning Spanish, and gaining insights into how different societies approached common challenges. She also joined a research team in Egypt, contributing to archaeological and anthropological studies that were expanding our understanding of ancient civilizations. These international experiences weren't luxury vacations or casual study abroad programs. Eve worked hard to fund these opportunities through scholarships, part-time jobs, and careful budgeting. She understood that each experience was an investment in her ability to understand and address complex global challenges. Her friends and family often marveled at her energy and determination, how she managed to balance demanding academics, extensive volunteer work, part-time jobs, and international travel, while still being the kind of friend who remembered birthdays, offered rides to the airport, and always had time to listen when someone needed support. By February 2008, Eve was 22 years old and in her final semester of college. She had already secured a job offer from a major company, a position that would allow her to begin building the career she had dreamed of since high school. Her academic advisors were encouraging her to consider graduate school, perhaps a joint degree program that would combine her interests in biology and political science. She was also exploring opportunities in public service, potentially working for a nonprofit organization focused on global health initiatives. Eve lived off campus with a close group of friends in a modest house that epitomized the college experience. It was the kind of place where friends gathered to study together, where impromptu dinner parties happened on weekday evenings, where everyone felt comfortable leaving their belongings around because trust was implicit. The house was located in a quiet residential neighborhood that was popular with students, close enough to campus for easy access to classes and events, but far enough away to feel like independent adult living. The choice to live off campus was common among upperclassmen at UNC. It represented freedom, responsibility, and a step toward the adult independence that would come after graduation. But it also meant being slightly outside the protective bubble of campus security, residential advisors, and the constant presence of university staff. In the context of 2008, this trade-off seemed reasonable, even desirable. Campus crime statistics were low. Violent crime in the surrounding neighborhoods was rare, and the benefits of off-campus leave-in lower costs. More privacy, the ability to have friends visit at any hour, seemed too far outweigh any potential risks. The evening of March 5th began like countless others in Eve's college experience. Her roommates were excited about a party they'd been invited to, the kind of social gathering that was a regular part of college life. Friends getting together, music, conversation, the simple pleasure of unwinding after a week of classes and work. They invited Eve to join them, and under different circumstances, she was social, well-liked, and always welcome at these kinds of gatherings. But Eve had papers to write, exams to prepare for, and the disciplined habits that had carried her through high school and most of college. She made the responsible choice, the choice that her parents would have been proud of, the choice that demonstrated the kind of character that had earned her scholarships, leadership positions, and job offers. She chose to stay home and study. Around 1:30 in the morning, her roommates left for the party. Eve was settled in for what she expected to be several more hours of quiet study time. Her computer was open, textbooks were arranged around her workspace, and she had everything she needed for a productive night of academic work. The house was quiet, the neighborhood was peaceful, and she had no reason to expect that anything unusual was about to happen. But just a few miles away, two young men were driving through the darkness with entirely different intentions. They weren't students, they weren't part of the university community, and they were UN-bound by any of the social contracts that made places like Chapel Hill feel safe. They were looking for an opportunity, scanning the quiet streets for someone vulnerable, someone alone, someone who might have something worth taking. In the predatory calculus of their thinking, a young college student home alone in a house with lights on represented exactly what they were looking for. What happened next would shatter not just Eve's life and the lives of everyone who loved her, but also the sense of security that had defined this community for generations. It would expose how quickly safety can become vulnerability, how random violence can intrude into the most protected spaces, and how the assumptions we make about our own security can be tragically, fatally wrong. The investigation that would follow would reveal a level of senseless brutality that shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. It would also demonstrate how modern investigative techniques, surveillance footage, cell phone data, financial records, could piece together a timeline of events with chilling precision, creating a detailed picture of Evie's final hours that would be both crucial for justice and devastating for everyone who cared about her. But this story isn't just about the crime itself. It's about how a community responds when its fundamental assumptions about safety are destroyed, how a university grapples with its responsibility to protect students who live beyond its immediate control, and how tragedy can sometimes catalyze meaningful change in policies, laws, and social attitudes. It is about how the memory of one exceptional young woman continues to influence how we think about campus safety, criminal justice, and the responsibilities we have to protect one another. As we delve deeper into this case, we'll see how modern investigative techniques unraveled a crime that initially seemed almost impossible to solve, how the legal system struggled with questions about juvenile justice and appropriate punishment, and how Eve's legacy continues to shape policy and inspire others more than a decade after her death. This is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, vulnerability, and the thin line between safety and danger that exists in even our most trusted communities. The hours between 1:30 a.m. and 5 a.m. on March 5, 2008 would prove to be among the most crucial in Chapel Hill's modern history. During this narrow window of time, a crime would unfold that would challenge everything the community thought it knew about safety, security, and the nature of random violence. To understand what happened, we need to reconstruct not just the timeline of events, but the social and criminal context that made this tragedy possible. Lawrence Lovett was 17 years old in March 2008, but his age belied an extensive criminal history that painted a troubling picture of a young man already deeply embedded in a pattern of violence and lawlessness. Despite his youth, Lovett had accumulated multiple arrests and convictions for robbery, assault, drug offenses, and weapons violations. His criminal record represented a failure of multiple systems, educational, social, juvenile justice, that were theoretically designed to intervene before a young person became a serious threat to public safety. The juvenile justice system in North Carolina, like in many states, operated under the premise that young offenders could be that harsh punishment was less effective than counseling, education, and community service. Lovett had been through this system multiple times, receiving sentences that emphasized rehabilitation over incarceration, early release programs that were meant to reintegrate him into society, and probation arrangements that assumed he would comply with court orders and make better choices in the future. But the system had failed to account for individuals like Lovett, who seemed impervious to rehabilitation efforts and who viewed early release not as an opportunity for redemption, but as a chance to commit more crimes. Just 2 days after Eve's murder, Lovett was scheduled to appear in court for carrying a handgun while on probation, a violation that demonstrated his continued disregard for the law and his willingness to escalate the violence of his criminal activities. DeMario Atwater was 21 years old and represented an even more troubling example of how the criminal justice system had failed to protect the public. His criminal history was extensive and escalating, including multiple arrests for robbery, assault, drug offenses, and other violent crimes. Despite this pattern of increasing violence, Atwater had been released early from jail sentences on several occasions, benefiting from overcrowding policies and rehabilitation programs that assumed he would take advantage of these opportunities to change his life. The decision to release Atwater early would prove to be a fatal error in judgment. Instead of using his freedom to pursue legitimate opportunities, he had continued committing crimes and had now escalated to a level of violence that would destroy multiple lives. His criminal history suggested someone who was becoming more dangerous over time, more willing to use violence to achieve his goals, and more contemptuous of the legal system that had repeatedly given him second chances. The connection between Atwater and Lovett represents one of the most troubling aspects of this case. Despite their age difference, they had developed a criminal partnership that amplified the danger each posed individually. Cell phone records would later reveal that they communicated frequently, planning crimes together and sharing information about potential targets and opportunities. Their relationship demonstrates how criminal networks can form and persist, how experienced criminals can mentor younger ones, and how these partnerships can lead to increasingly serious offenses. On the night of March 5, 2008, Atwater and Lovett made a decision that would change their lives forever and end Eve's. According to Atwater's later confession, Lovett had called him with a proposal. They should drive to the university area and find someone to rob. This wasn't a spontaneous decision born of desperation or immediate need. It was a calculated choice to commit a violent crime against a random victim, with the university campus chosen specifically because they believed students would have money, credit cards, and other valuable items. The choice to target university students was particularly calculated and disturbing. College campuses had long been viewed as relatively safe spaces, protected by their own security forces surrounded by communities that were invested in maintaining order and safety and populated by young people who were generally law-abiding and focused on their education. But this relative safety also made students attractive targets for criminals who understood that students often had access to financial resources, credit cards, bank accounts funded by parents or student loans, valuable electronics, and vehicles. Atwater and Lovett drove through the quiet streets of Chapel Hill in the early morning hours, scanning for opportunities. They were looking for someone who appeared vulnerable, alone, and potentially valuable as a target. The house where Eve lived, with lights visible from the street and a car in the driveway, would have suggested that someone was home and awake. Exactly what they were looking for. The attack began sometime after 1:30 a.m., when Eve's roommates had left for their party and she was alone in the house, focused on her studies. According to Atwater's later testimony, they observed Eve through a window, confirming that she was alone and apparently unaware of any danger. Armed with handguns, they made the decision to enter the house and confront her directly. What happened next reveals the terrifying randomness of violent crime and the complete vulnerability of even the most cautious, responsible people when confronted with determined predators. Eve, who had made every reasonable choice to ensure her safety staying home, studying, living in a good neighborhood with friends, found herself face to face with armed strangers who had chosen her completely at random. The invasion of Eve's home represents a violation that goes beyond simple robbery or assault. A person's home, particularly for a young college student, represents security, autonomy, and the fundamental assumption that there are spaces where we can let down our guard and focus on the activities that matter most to us. Eve was engaged in the most benign, admirable activity imaginable, studying for her classes, preparing for her future, doing everything that society expects and rewards young people for doing. The armed intruders destroyed this sense of security instantly and completely. They forced Eve into her own car, turning her vehicle another symbol of independence and mobility into a prison. The next several hours would involve a terrifying journey through the city as they attempted to extract as much money as possible from her bank accounts while she sat helplessly in her own car, watching familiar landmarks pass by, knowing that her life was in the hands of people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence. The ATM withdrawals that followed revealed the cold, methodical nature of the crime. This wasn't a robbery that escalated beyond the perpetrator's intentions. It was a carefully executed plan to maximize their financial gain while minimizing the risk of detection. They drove to multiple locations, forcing Eve to provide her PIN number, attempting to withdraw as much money as possible before hitting daily limits imposed by her bank. During these hours, Eve was completely at the mercy of her captors. Atwater would later testify that she pleaded with them to let her go, promising that she wouldn't report the crime or identify them to police. She just wanted to return home, to continue her studies, to pursue the future she had worked so hard to build. Her pleas demonstrate both her terror and her desperate hope that this nightmare might end without further violence. But Atwater and Lovett had never intended to let her go. From the beginning, they had made a calculation that Eve's ability to identify them made her too dangerous to release. They had made no effort to conceal their faces or their identities, suggesting that they had always planned to eliminate the witness to their crime. This premeditation would prove crucial in the legal proceedings that followed. Distinguishing this case from robberies, where violence erupts spontaneously, the decision to kill Eve was made with chilly. According to Atwater's confession, they discussed it openly while she was present in the car, as if they were deciding what to have for dinner or which route to take home. They had succeeded in withdrawing $700 from her accounts, a sum that represented grocery money for college students, a modest amount that couldn't possibly justify the violence they were contemplating. After exhausting her daily withdrawal limits, they drove to a desolate area on the outskirts of Chapel Hill. The location they chose was isolated enough to minimize the risk of witnesses, but accessible enough to allow them to escape quickly after committing the murder. It was a calculated choice that demonstrated their familiarity with the area and their understanding of how to commit violent crimes while minimizing their chances of being caught. In those final moments, Eve made one last desperate appeal to whatever humanity might remain in her captors. According to Atwater's testimony, she asked them to pray with her. This request reveals everything about who Eve was, even in her final moments. Faced with people who had already demonstrated their capacity for evil, she reached for something spiritual, something that might connect them to their better natures, something that might remind them that she was a human being with hopes, dreams, and people who loved her. The response to her request was swift and merciless. Instead of showing any compassion or reconsidering their decision, Atwater and Lovett shot Eve multiple times with 2 different handguns. The medical examiner would later confirm that she had been shot multiple times. Wounds that were intended to ensure she could not survive to identify her attackers or testify about their crimes. By 5 a.m., it was over. Eve Carson, who had spent the evening preparing for her future, was dead in a remote location just 1 mile from her home. Her killers drove away in her car, already planning their next moves, already thinking about how to avoid detection and continue their criminal careers. They left behind a young woman whose potential contributions to the world would never be realized, whose dreams would never be fulfilled, whose family and friends would spend the rest of their lives grieving an unimaginable loss. But they also left behind evidence. Modern forensic science and investigative techniques would soon begin to construct a detailed picture of their crimes, using surveillance footage, cell phone data, financial records, and DNA analysis to build a case that would ultimately lead to their capture and conviction. The very technologies they had hoped to avoid, ATM cameras, cell tower data, electronic banking records, would become the tools that brought them to justice. The sound of gunshots echoing through the pre-dawn darkness of Chapel Hill marked not just the end of Eve Carson's life, but the beginning of one of the most intensive criminal investigations in the area's modern history. Within hours, what had begun as a missing person report would transform into a homicide case that would test every resource of local law enforcement and ultimately expose both the capabilities and limitations of modern investigative techniques. At approximately 5 a.m. on March 5, 2008, a resident living roughly 1 mile from Eve's home was jolted awake by sounds that would haunt her memory forever. The sharp crack of gunshots pierced the early morning quiet, followed immediately by what she would later describe to police as a terrifying, anguished scream. In those seconds, she became an unwitting witness to the final moments of a crime that had been unfolding for hours across the city. The woman's decision to call police immediately proved crucial to the investigation. Her call established a precise timeline for Eve's death and provided investigators with an exact location to begin their search. When patrol officers responded to the scene, they discovered a young woman's body in an area that was isolated enough for the killers to have felt secure from immediate detection, but accessible enough for them to escape quickly afterward. The initial crime scene presented investigators with a complex puzzle. The victim had no identification, no purse, no cell phone, nothing that could immediately establish who she was or why she might have been killed in this location. She appeared to be a young college student based on her age and appearance, but Chapel Hill was home to thousands of students who fit that general description. Without identification, the investigation faced its first major challenge: determining the victim's identity so they could begin to understand the circumstances that had led to her death. The condition of the body provided immediate clues about the nature of the crime. Multiple gunshot wounds indicated this was not an accidental shooting or a crime of passion that had escalated beyond the perpetrator's intentions. This was a deliberate, execution-style killing that suggested the victim had been targeted for reasons that investigators would need to determine. The medical examiner, as preliminary assessment, confirmed that the victim had been shot multiple times with what appeared to be 2 different firearms, indicating that multiple shooters had been involved. The location itself told a story. The isolated area where Eve's body was found was not somewhere a college student would typically go alone, especially in the early morning hours. This suggested that she had been brought there against her will, either as part of a planned attack or as the final destination in a crime that had begun elsewhere. The fact that her body was left in the open rather than concealed suggested that her killers were either confident they would be discovered immediately or were too focused on escaping to worry about hiding the evidence of their crime. Meanwhile, back at Eve's house, her roommates were experiencing the growing anxiety that comes when someone you care about disappears without explanation. When they returned from their party around 4:30 a.m., the signs of something wrong were immediately apparent. The front door was standing wide open. Lights were still on throughout the house, and Eve was nowhere to be found. Her car was also missing from the driveway where it had been parked when they left earlier that evening. The open door was particularly disturbing. Eve was not the kind of person who would leave her home unsecured, especially late at night. She was careful about personal safety, conscientious about protecting her belongings and those of her roommates, and aware of the basic security measures that were part of responsible adult living. An open door suggested either a hasty departure under stressful circumstances or evidence that someone else had been involved in her leaving the house. Her roommate's attempts to reach Eve by phone went unanswered, which was also uncharacteristic. Eve was generally responsive to calls and texts from friends, especially when they involve coordination about shared living arrangements or safety concerns. Her failure to answer calls added to the growing sense that something serious had happened, though. Her friends still hoped for an innocent explanation, perhaps a family emergency that had required her to leave quickly, or an unexpected opportunity that had caused her to change her plans spontaneously. By the next day, March 6, Eve's continued absence had escalated from concern to genuine alarm. One of her friends made the decision to contact police and file a missing person report, a choice that would prove crucial in connecting Evie's disappearance to the unidentified body that had been discovered that morning. The timing of the missing person report, coming just hours after the body was found, allowed investigators to quickly establish a potential connection between the two cases. When police showed Eve's friend a photograph of the victim, the identification was immediate and heartbreaking. The friend's recognition of Eve not only solved the mystery of the unidentified body, but also provided investigators with their first solid leads about the circumstances surrounding her death. They now knew who the victim was, where she lived, and could begin to construct a timeline of her final hours. The confirmation of Evie's identity transformed the investigation from a routine homicide case into something much more significant. Eve was not just any college student. She was the student body president of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, one of the most recognizable and beloved figures on campus. Her murder would send shockwaves through the university community and attract intense media attention from across the nation. Investigators immediately began the meticulous process of reconstructing Eve's final hours. They interviewed her roommates extensively, documenting exactly when they had last seen her alive, what her plans had been for the evening, and any unusual circumstances or concerns she might have mentioned. The timeline they established was precise. Eve had been alive and safely at home at 1:30 a.m. when her roommates left for the party, but by 5 a.m. her body was discovered a mile away. This 3.5-hour window became the focus of intense investigative attention. The search of Eve's room revealed important clues about the nature of the crime. Her wallet was missing, as were her credit cards and identification, clear indicators that robbery had been at least one motive for the attack. The absence of these items suggested that her killers had taken time to search through her belongings and remove anything of value, indicating that this was not a spontaneous crime of passion but a calculated robbery that had ended in murder. Significantly, medical examiners confirmed that there were no signs of sexual assault, ruling out one potential motive and helping investigators focus their attention on robbery as the primary driver of the crime. This finding was important both for the investigation and for Eve's family, who was spared the additional trauma of knowing that she had suffered sexual violence in her final hours. The examination of Eve's computer provided another crucial piece of the timeline. Forensic analysis revealed that her laptop had been active until approximately 3:30 a.m., indicating that she had continued studying for nearly 2 hours after her roommates left the house. This meant that the attack had occurred sometime between 3:30 a.m. and 5 a.m., a narrow window that would prove crucial in analyzing other evidence, particularly cell phone data and surveillance footage. Cell phone records became a critical component of the investigation. Eve's phone records showed that her last signal had come from a cell tower near a highway just outside Chapel Hill, but the phone itself was never recovered. Investigators suspected that her killers had destroyed or discarded the phone somewhere in the woods, eliminating a potential source of evidence that could have provided additional details about their movements and communications. The discovery of Eve's abandoned car provided the first major break in the case. The vehicle was found just a few miles from her home, apparently ditched by her killers after they had finished using it to transport her and access her bank accounts. The car was immediately impounded and sent to the state crime laboratory for comprehensive forensic analysis, including fingerprinting and DNA testing that might identify who had been inside the vehicle during the crime. While forensic technicians processed the physical evidence, detectives began the painstaking work of canvassing the area where Eve's body was found, searching for witnesses who might have seen or heard something unusual during the early morning hours of March 5th. They also began reviewing surveillance footage from businesses and traffic cameras throughout Chapel Hill, looking for any images of Eve's car during the hours when she was being held captive. The investigation quickly expanded to include financial institutions throughout the region. Detectives requested Eve's banking records and credit card transaction histories, hoping to track any unauthorized use of her accounts that might provide clues about her killers' identities or whereabouts. This financial investigation would soon provide the breakthrough that investigators desperately needed. Meanwhile, news of Eve's murder was spreading throughout the University of North Carolina campus and the broader Chapel Hill community. The initial shock was followed by fear, as students and residents realized that someone capable of such violence was still at large in their community. The university increased security patrols, students began traveling in groups and avoiding isolated areas, and parents throughout the region began questioning whether their children were safe attending college in what had previously been considered one of the safest communities in North Carolina. The media attention surrounding the case was intense and immediate. Local television stations provided continuous coverage. National news networks picked up the story, and newspapers throughout the region devoted front-page coverage to the investigation. The combination of Eve's prominence on campus, the random nature of the attack, and the apparent senselessness of the violence created a story that captured public attention and put enormous pressure on law enforcement to solve the case quickly. This pressure was both helpful and challenging for investigators. The intense media coverage generated hundreds of tips from the public, as people called in to report anything they thought might be relevant to the case. Students reported suspicious behavior they had observed around campus. Residents described unusual activities in their neighborhoods, and witnesses came forward with information about crimes or incidents that might be related to Eve's murder. However, the overwhelming volume of tips also created logistical challenges for the investigation. Each tip had to be evaluated, prioritized, and followed up on, requiring enormous amounts of time and manpower. Many tips proved irrelevant or based on misunderstandings, but investigators couldn't afford to ignore any potential lead that might help solve the case. As detectives worked around the clock to process physical evidence, interview witnesses, and follow up on tips, they were also beginning to develop theories about the nature of the crime and the type of perpetrators they were looking for. The evidence suggested that this was not a crime committed by someone known to Eve. There were no signs of a personal relationship gone wrong, no evidence of stalking or harassment, and no indication that she had been specifically targeted because of who she was or what she represented. Instead, the evidence pointed toward a random crime of opportunity, committed by individuals who had selected Eve simply because she appeared vulnerable and potentially lucrative as a robbery target. This theory was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it suggested that other students were not necessarily at risk from someone who specifically targeted university community members, but terrifying because it meant that the killers might strike again, choosing their next victim just as randomly as they had chosen Eve. The financial investigation was beginning to yield results. Bank records showed that someone had attempted to use Evie's credit cards and ATM cards multiple times throughout the night of March 5th and into March 6th. The pattern of attempted transactions painted a picture of killers who were methodically trying to extract as much money as possible from their victims' accounts, continuing their criminal activity even after they had already committed murder. The ATM transactions became the key to cracking the case. While many of the machines that had been used were not equipped with surveillance cameras, detectives had identified at least one location where clear footage might be available. The process of obtaining and analyzing this footage would provide the first visual evidence of Eve's killers and set the stage for their eventual identification and capture. As the investigation entered its second week, the pressure on law enforcement continued to intensify. The university community remained on edge. Parents were demanding answers about campus safety, and media outlets were providing daily coverage of the case. But behind the scenes, Investigators were methodically building a case based on forensic evidence, financial records, and surveillance footage that would ultimately lead them to two young men whose criminal histories had already marked them as dangerous predators. The breakthrough that investigators had been hoping for came not from witness testimony or physical evidence, but from the methodical analysis of financial records and surveillance footage that would reveal the identities of Eve's killers. The discovery that someone had been using Evie's credit cards and ATM cards after her murder provided a digital trail that would ultimately lead police directly to the perpetrators, demonstrating how modern technology had made it increasingly difficult for criminals to completely cover their tracks. The pattern of ATM transactions told a chilling story. Beginning just 18 minutes after Eve's computer had last been active, indicating when she had likely been taken from her home, someone began attempting to withdraw money from her bank accounts. The first successful transaction occurred at 3:48 a.m., when $400 was withdrawn from an ATM located at a shopping center on the far side of Chapel Hill. A second transaction followed immediately, withdrawing another $300 and hitting the $700 daily limit imposed by her bank's security protocols. Additional attempts to withdraw money were blocked by the daily limit, but the pattern of attempted transactions continued throughout the early morning hours. The perpetrators tried multiple ATMs across the city, apparently unaware of or unconcerned about the daily limits that would prevent them from accessing more money. This persistence suggested either desperation for cash or an assumption that they could somehow circumvent the banking system as security measures. The location of the successful ATM transactions was significant. The shopping center where the withdrawals occurred was approximately 15 minutes by car from Eve's house, but in a direction that would have required her killers to drive across town rather than toward the location where her body was eventually found. This suggested that the crime had involved considerable movement around the city, with Eve being held captive in her own car as her killers drove from location to location, trying to maximize their financial gain from their robbery. When investigators requested surveillance footage from the ATM location, they discovered that they had captured clear images of the crime in progress. The footage showed a man sitting in the driver's seat of Eve's car, using her ATM card to withdraw money from her account. In the backseat of the vehicle, there appeared to be another person, though the image quality made it impossible to determine definitively whether this was Eve herself or another perpetrator. The possibility that Eve had still been alive during the ATM transactions was both hopeful and horrifying. If she had been in the car during these withdrawals, it meant that she had endured hours of terror, knowing that she was completely at the mercy of armed strangers who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence. It also meant that her killers had kept her alive long enough to ensure they could access her money, adding a calculating element to their crimes that made them seem even more callous and predatory. Forensic experts attempted to enhance the surveillance footage to get clearer images of both the driver and any passengers in Eve's car. Unfortunately, the image quality was insufficient to provide definitive identification, though the footage did establish that a black male in his early 20s had been driving Eve's vehicle and using her financial accounts. This was the first concrete description of one of her killers, and it would prove crucial when investigators eventually developed suspects. The investigation of financial records revealed that attempts to use Evie's cards continued for several days after her murder. The perpetrators tried to use her ATM card at multiple locations throughout Chapel Hill and surrounding areas, though most of these attempts were unsuccessful due to daily withdrawal limits and increased security monitoring triggered by the suspicious activity. However, each attempt created a digital record of the time and location, providing investigators with a detailed map of the killer's movements in the days following the murder. On March 7th, 2 days after Eve's murder, police received an automated alert about another attempted ATM transaction using Eve's card. This time, the attempt occurred at a 24-hour convenience store in a neighboring town. Around 12:30 a.m., officers responded immediately to the location, hoping to catch the perpetrator in the act. But by the time they arrived, whoever had attempted the transaction had already left the scene. However, this convenience store had a functioning security camera system, and the footage provided investigators with their second major breakthrough. The surveillance video showed someone attempting to use Eve's ATM card, but in a development that complicated the investigation significantly. This was clearly a different person from the man who had been captured on camera driving Eve's car during the initial withdrawals. The second suspect appeared to be younger than the first, possibly still a teenager, and had distinctly different physical characteristics. This discovery forced investigators to revise their understanding of the crime, rather than looking for a single perpetrator or even two people who had worked together throughout the entire incident. They now had to consider the possibility that Eve's killers had either recruited additional accomplices after the murder or had distributed her stolen property to other criminals who were now attempting to use her financial accounts. The involvement of multiple suspects raised troubling questions about the scope of the criminal network that had been responsible for Eve's death. If her killers were part of a larger group of criminals who regularly collaborated on robberies and other violent crimes, it suggested that the threat to the community might be broader than initially understood. It also meant that the investigation would need to identify not just the primary perpetrators, but also anyone who had assisted them or benefited from their crimes. Despite the challenges posed by having multiple suspects captured on surveillance footage, the images provided investigators with concrete leads to pursue. They released both sets of footage to local media outlets, asking for the public's assistance in identifying the individuals shown in the videos. The decision to make the surveillance footage public was a calculated risk. It would generate additional tips and might lead to immediate identification of the suspects, but it would also alert the perpetrators that they had been captured on camera and might cause them to flee or destroy additional evidence. The media coverage of the surveillance footage was extensive. Local television stations broadcast the images repeatedly. Newspapers published still frames from the videos, and the university distributed the footage through its communication channels to ensure that students and faculty had an opportunity to see the suspects. The response from the public was immediate and overwhelming, with the police department receiving hundreds of calls from people who thought they recognized one or both of the individuals in the footage. Processing this volume of tips required enormous resources and careful prioritization. Investigators had to evaluate each call to determine which ones represented credible identification and which were based on superficial resemblances or wishful thinking. Many callers provided names of people they thought looked like the suspects, but further investigation often revealed that these individuals had solid alibis for the time of the crime or did unmatch other aspects of the physical evidence. The breakthrough came on March 12th, exactly 1 week after Eve's murder, when an anonymous caller contacted police with information that would ultimately crack the case. The caller claimed to recognize the younger suspect from the convenience store surveillance footage and identified him as Atwater, a 21-year-old man with an extensive criminal history in the Chapel Hill area. When investigators began researching Atwater's background, they discovered a troubling pattern of escalating criminal behavior that painted a picture of someone who posed a significant ongoing threat to public safety. Despite his young age, Atwater had accumulated multiple arrests for robbery, assault, drug offenses, and weapons violations. His criminal record showed a progression from relatively minor offenses to increasingly serious crimes involving violence and weapons. Perhaps most significantly, investigators learned that Atwater had been released early from jail on several recent occasions, benefiting from overcrowding policies and rehabilitation programs that were designed to provide nonviolent offenders with opportunities to reform their behavior. However, rather than taking advantage of these opportunities to change his life, Atwater had continued committing crimes and had apparently escalated to the level of violence that had resulted in Eve's murder. The timing of Atwater's criminal activity was particularly disturbing. Records showed that just 2 days after Eve's murder, he had been scheduled to appear in court for carrying a handgun while on probation, a serious violation that demonstrated his continued disregard for the legal system and his willingness to arm himself despite being under court supervision. His failure to appear for this hearing had resulted in an outstanding warrant for his arrest, though police had not yet been able to locate him. Investigators compared old mugshots of Atwater with the surveillance footage from the convenience store and found a striking resemblance that convinced them they had identified the correct suspect. The facial features, build, and general appearance matched closely enough to provide probable cause for bringing Atwater in for questioning, though they would need additional evidence to build a strong case for prosecution. The next step was locating Atwater, who had apparently gone into hiding since Eve's murder. Investigators learned that he lived in an apartment complex in a neighboring town, but when they arrived at his last known address, they discovered that he had not been seen there for several days. His family members and known associates claimed to have no knowledge of his whereabouts, though investigators suspected that someone in his social network was helping him avoid arrest. While the search for Atwater continued, investigators also began trying to identify the first suspect, the man who had been captured driving Evie's car during the initial ATM withdrawals. Analysis of Atwater's phone records and known associates led them to focus on Lawrence Lovett, the 68-year-old who had been in frequent communication with Atwater in the days leading up to Eve's murder. Despite his youth, Lovett already had his own criminal record. that included arrests for robbery, assault, and drug offenses. The pattern was disturbingly similar to Atwater's history. A young person who had been cycling through the juvenile justice system without receiving the kind of intervention that might have prevented him from escalating to more serious crimes. His age meant that many of his previous offenses had been handled in juvenile court, with records that were sealed and sentences that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. When investigators obtained Levette's most recent mugshot and compared it to the surveillance footage of the person driving Eve's car, they found another strong match. The combination of physical appearance, criminal history, and known association with Atwater convinced them that they had identified both primary suspects in Eve's murder. Now they needed to locate both young men and build a case that would stand up in court. The search for Lovett proved more challenging than expected. When investigators arrived at his home to make an arrest, they discovered that he had no intention of surrendering peacefully. Rather than coming to the door to speak with police, Lovett barricaded himself inside the house, apparently hoping to avoid arrest or perhaps planning some kind of violent confrontation with law enforcement. The standoff that followed required police to call in their SWAT team, trained specialists equipped to handle dangerous situations involving armed suspects who refused to surrender. The deployment of SWAT resources in a residential neighborhood created additional complications, requiring the evacuation of nearby homes and the establishment of a security perimeter that disrupted the entire area for several hours. During the standoff, negotiators attempted to communicate with Lovett, encouraging him to surrender peacefully and avoid additional charges that could result from resisting arrest or threatening police officers. However, Lovett remained unresponsive to these efforts, apparently believing that he could somehow avoid arrest by simply refusing to come out of the house. Eventually, SWAT officers were able to enter the residence and take Lovett into custody without anyone being injured. His resistance to arrest demonstrated a level of desperation that suggested he understood the seriousness of the charges he was facing and the likelihood that he would spend many years in prison if convicted of Eve's murder. With both suspects in custody, investigators could begin the detailed process of building their case for prosecution. Both Atwater and Lovett initially denied any involvement in Eve's murder, claiming that they had never seen her before and had no knowledge of the crimes that had been committed. However, the physical evidence against them was substantial and growing stronger as forensic analysis continued. Cell phone data provided crucial corroboration of the suspect's involvement in the crime. Records showed that both Atwater's and Lovett's phones had connected to cell towers near Eve's neighborhood during the early morning hours of March 5th, despite the fact that both lived in a different city and had no apparent reason to be in that area at that time. This electronic evidence placed them at the scene of the crime during the time window when Eve had been kidnapped and murdered. The pattern of cell tower connections also correlated with the locations where Eve's Atom card had been used, providing additional evidence that Atwater and Lovett had been together during the commission of the crime and had used her vehicle to travel throughout the city while attempting to access her bank accounts. This digital trail would prove crucial in court, providing an objective timeline of events that corroborated other evidence and made it very difficult for the defendants to claim they had been elsewhere during the crime. DNA evidence recovered from Eve's car also supported the prosecution's case. Forensic analyses identified genetic material from both suspects inside the vehicle, confirming that they had been present in the car during the time period when Eve was being held captive. This physical evidence provided a direct link between the suspects and the crime scene that would be extremely difficult for defense attorneys to explain away. As the evidence mounted against them, prosecutors began preparing for what they expected to be complex legal proceedings that would involve questions about appropriate punishment, the role of juvenile offenders in adult crimes, and the death penalty for particularly heinous murders. The case would test the criminal justice system's ability to respond appropriately to crimes that shocked the community and demanded serious consequences for the perpetrators. The legal proceedings that followed would reveal additional details about the crime, provide closure for Eve's family and the university community, and ultimately result in justice for a young woman whose life had been cut short by senseless violence. But the case would also raise broader questions about criminal justice policies, juvenile rehabilitation programs, and the responsibilities of the legal system to protect public safety while providing opportunities for redemption and reform. The arrest of Demario Atwater and Lawrence Lovett marked the end of the intensive manhunt that had consumed law enforcement resources throughout central North Carolina for more than a week. But their capture also marked the beginning of a complex legal process that would test the criminal justice system's ability to handle a case involving extreme violence, juvenile offenders, and questions about appropriate punishment for crimes that had shocked the entire state. Both suspects continued to maintain their innocence, despite the mounting evidence against them. Their denials were consistent with the typical response of defendants facing serious criminal charges, particularly when those charges could result in life imprisonment or even the death penalty. However, the evidence collected by investigators was comprehensive and compelling, creating a case that would be very difficult for defense attorneys to challenge successfully. The physical evidence alone was substantial. DNA analysis had confirmed that both Atwater and Lovett had been inside Eve's car during the time period when she was being held captive. Surveillance footage had captured them using her ATM card to withdraw money from her accounts. Cell phone records placed them in her neighborhood during the crucial time window when she was kidnapped from her home. Financial records documented their continued attempts to access her money for days after her murder. Perhaps most importantly, the timeline constructed by investigators was detailed and consistent. They could demonstrate that Eve had been alive and safely at home until at least 3:30 a.m., when her computer was last active. ATM transactions using her cards began just 18 minutes later, indicating that the attack on her home had occurred within a very narrow time window. The locations and timing of subsequent transactions created a map of the killer's movements that corresponded perfectly with cell phone data and other evidence. Prosecutors faced a complex decision about how to handle the charges against each defendant. The evidence clearly showed that both men had been involved in the crime, but their different ages and potentially different levels of responsibility created legal complications that would need to be addressed carefully. DeMario Atwater, at 21 years old, would be tried as an adult and could potentially face the death penalty if prosecutors chose to seek the ultimate punishment. His extensive criminal history, the premeditated nature of the crime, and the particular cruelty involved in forcing Evie to endure hours of terror before killing her all suggested that this case might warrant capital punishment. North Carolina had used the death penalty for similar crimes in the past, and public sentiment in the community strongly supported severe punishment for Eve's killers. Lawrence Lovett presented a more complicated case. At 17 years old at the time of the crime, he was technically a juvenile, though North Carolina law allowed for juveniles to be charged as adults in cases involving particularly serious crimes. The decision about whether to try Lovett as an adult or as a juvenile would have significant implications for the potential punishment he could receive and the legal procedures that would govern his case. The juvenile justice system was designed around the principle that young offenders had greater capacity for rehabilitation and should generally receive less severe punishments than adults who committed similar crimes. However, Lovett's extensive criminal history and the extreme nature of Eve's murder raised questions about whether traditional juvenile justice approaches were appropriate for someone who had already demonstrated such a capacity for violence. If tried as an adult, Lovett could potentially face life imprisonment, though his age at the time of the crime would likely preclude the death penalty. If tried as a juvenile, he would face significantly less severe punishment and would potentially be eligible for release while still a young man. The decision would ultimately depend on prosecutors' assessment of public safety, the likelihood of successful rehabilitation, and the community's demand for appropriate punishment. As the legal process moved forward, both defendants were held in custody without bail, reflecting the seriousness of the charges and the risk they posed to public safety. Their detention also ensured that they would be available for trial and prevented any possibility that they might flee or commit additional crimes while awaiting legal proceedings. The investigation continued even after the arrests, as prosecutors worked to build the strongest possible case for trial. Additional forensic analysis was conducted on physical evidence recovered from the crime scene and from Eve's car. Investigators continued interviewing witnesses and following up on tips from the public. Financial institutions provided detailed records of all transactions involving Eve's accounts, creating a comprehensive picture of how her stolen cards had been used. During this period, investigators also began exploring connections between Atwater and Lovett and other unsolved crimes in the region. The systematic way they had carried out Eve's murder suggested experience with violent crime, and detectives wondered whether they might have been responsible for other robberies, assaults, or even murders that remained unsolved. This investigation revealed disturbing patterns in both suspects' criminal histories. Lawrence Lovett had been a suspect in another chillingly similar case that had occurred just 2 months before Eve's murder. In January 2008, A 29-year-old graduate student named Obahijid Mahato had been killed during a home invasion at his apartment near the University of North Carolina campus. Following Mahato's murder, someone had used his ATM card to withdraw money from various locations throughout Chapel Hill, creating a pattern nearly identical to what had happened after Eve's death. The similarities between the two cases were striking. Both involved young students who were attacked in their homes during late night or early morning hours. Both victims had been forced to provide access to their financial accounts before being killed. Both cases involved the systematic use of stolen ATM cards at multiple locations throughout the city. The geographic proximity of the crimes, the similar methodology, and the timeline connecting them all suggested that the same perpetrators might have been responsible for both murders. However, despite the compelling similarities, investigators were never able to develop sufficient evidence to charge Lovett with Mahato's murder. The surveillance footage from ATMs used after Mahato's death was not clear enough to provide definitive identification. DNA evidence was inconclusive. Witnesses who might have provided crucial testimony could not make positive identifications. Ultimately, prosecutors determined that they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Lovett had been responsible for the earlier killing, and those charges were dropped. The inability to connect Lovett to the Mahato murder was frustrating for investigators and prosecutors, who believed they were dealing with a serial killer who had refined his methods between the two attacks. It also meant that Lovett might have been responsible for additional crimes that would never be prosecuted, leaving other families without the closure that comes with successful prosecution of their loved ones' killers. As the legal proceedings moved toward trial, prosecutors faced a crucial strategic decision about how to handle DiMario Atwater's case. The evidence against him was strong, but not overwhelming. While DNA evidence and surveillance footage clearly placed him at the scene and showed him using Eve's stolen cards, he had not been captured on camera actually committing the murder or directly harming Evie. His defense attorneys would likely argue that he had been an accomplice to robbery rather than a primary perpetrator of murder, potentially reducing his exposure to the death penalty. Prosecutors calculated that offering Atwater a plea bargain might be the most effective way to ensure a conviction and also provide crucial testimony against Lovett, who appeared to have been the more active participant in the actual killing. A plea agreement would guarantee that Atwater would spend the rest of his life in prison while also providing prosecutors with an insider's account of exactly how the crime had been committed. The plea negotiations reflected the pragmatic realities of criminal prosecution. While community sentiment strongly supported the death penalty for both killers, prosecutors had to consider the strength of their evidence, the costs and uncertainties of capital trials, and the strategic value of securing testimony from one defendant against the other. A plea bargain would eliminate the risk of an unsuccessful death penalty prosecution while ensuring that justice was served through lengthy imprisonment. After extensive negotiations, Atwater's defense attorneys advised him to accept a plea agreement that would remove the threat of capital punishment in exchange for a guilty plea in cooperation with the prosecution of Lovett. Faced with a choice between a certain death sentence if convicted at trial and life imprisonment through a plea agreement, Atwater chose to confess and provide detailed testimony about the crime. Atwater's confession provided the first complete account of what had happened to Eve during her final hours. His testimony revealed details that were both crucial for the legal case against Lovett and devastating for everyone who cared about Eve. The confession confirmed that the attack had been entirely random. Atwater and Lovett had simply been driving through the neighborhood looking for someone to rob when they noticed Eve through a window and decided to target her. According to Atwater's statement, the decision to kill Eve had been made early in the crime, not as a panicked response to unexpected circumstances, but as a calculated choice to eliminate a witness who could identify them. This premeditation was crucial for the legal case, as it distinguished their crime from robberies that escalated to violence unexpectedly and supported charges of first-degree murder rather than lesser offenses. Atwater also provided heartbreaking details about Eve's final moments. His testimony confirmed that she had pleaded for her life, had promised not to report the crime if they would let her go, and had ultimately asked them to pray with her before they killed her. These details painted a picture of a young woman who had maintained her dignity and her faith even in the face of certain death, but they also demonstrated the complete callousness of her killers who had responded to her pleas with violence. The confession also revealed the extent to which the crime had been motivated by greed rather than desperation. The $700 that Atwater and Lovett had stolen from Eve's accounts was not money they needed for survival. It was simply cash they wanted for discretionary spending. They had ended a promising young life for an amount of money that most college students might spend in a month on entertainment and miscellaneous expenses. With Atwater's cooperation secured, prosecutors moved forward with their case against Lawrence Lovett, who continued to maintain his innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. Lovett's defense team faced an almost impossible task: convincing a jury to acquit their client in the face of DNA evidence, surveillance, footage, cell phone records, financial documentation, and now testimony from his alleged accomplice. The legal proceedings that would follow would test not just the evidence against Lovett, but also broader questions about juvenile justice, appropriate punishment for heinous crimes, and the balance between rehabilitation and public safety in cases involving young offenders who had committed adult crimes. The outcome would determine whether justice had been served for Eve Carson, but it would also influence how similar cases would be handled in the future and what message society would send about the consequences of such senseless violence. The trial of Lawrence Lovett would become one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in North Carolina's recent history, not just because of the shocking nature of the crime, but because it would test the state's commitment to holding juvenile offenders accountable for adult crimes while navigating the complex legal and ethical questions surrounding the prosecution of minors for capital offenses. In April 2010, more than 2 years after Eve Carson's murder, Demario Atwater appeared before a judge to formally enter his guilty plea and receive his sentence. The courtroom was packed with Eve's family members, university officials, community leaders, and media representatives who had followed the case since the initial investigation. The delay between the crime and the sentencing had been necessary to allow for the extensive investigation, plea negotiations, and legal preparations that such a complex case required. When Judge Orlando Hudson asked Atwater to confirm his guilty plea, the young man's response was brief and showed little emotion. He acknowledged his responsibility for Eve's murder and confirmed that he understood the consequences of his plea agreement. Under the terms of the deal he had negotiated with prosecutors, Atwater would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years for related charges including kidnapping, robbery, and firearms violations. The life sentence meant that Atwater, who was still only 23 years old at the time of his sentencing, would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. The additional 30 years were largely symbolic, since he would already be serving a sentence that would never end, but they reflected the severity of his crimes and ensured that even if his life sentence were ever overturned on appeal, he would still face decades of imprisonment for the other charges. After Judge Hudson pronounced the sentence, Atwater surprised many observers by turning toward the section of the courtroom where Eve's parents were seated. In a brief statement, he apologized for his actions and acknowledged that he deserved the punishment he had received. His apology was met with mixed reactions. Some viewed it as a genuine expression of remorse, while others saw it as a calculated attempt to show contrition that might influence any future appeals or parole considerations. Eve's parents, Anne Marie and Thomas Carson, had maintained their dignity throughout the long legal process, rarely speaking to the media and focusing their energy on supporting the prosecution and preserving their daughter's memory. When given the opportunity to provide victim impact statements during Atwater's sentencing, they spoke movingly about the daughter they had lost and the future that had been stolen from her. Anne Marie Carson described Eve as a young woman who had been preparing to make significant contributions to society, someone whose career in public service or medicine could have improved the lives of countless people. She spoke about the family gatherings that would forever be marked by Eve's absence, the grandchildren she would never have, and the dreams that would never be fulfilled. Her statement was both a tribute to her daughter and a reminder of the full scope of the loss that Atwater's crimes had caused. Thomas Carson focused his statement on the impact that Eve's murder had had on the broader community and the importance of ensuring that such violence never happened again. He called for continued vigilance in protecting young people, and for meaningful reforms in the criminal justice system that might prevent other families from experiencing the devastation that his family had endured. With Atwater's case resolved, attention turned to the prosecution of Lawrence Lovett, whose trial was scheduled to begin in December 2011. Lovett's case was significantly more complex than Atwater's, both because he had refused to accept a plea agreement and because his age at the time of the crime raised difficult questions about appropriate punishment and the goals of juvenile justice. Lovett's defense team, led by experienced criminal defense attorneys, faced the challenging task of creating reasonable doubt about their client's guilt. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, their strategy focused on questioning the reliability of witness identifications, challenging the interpretation of forensic evidence, and arguing that Atwater's confession was self-serving and designed to minimize his own responsibility while maximizing Lovette's culpability. The defense also attempted to present evidence about Lovette's troubled childhood and the social circumstances that had contributed to his early involvement in criminal activity. They argued that he had been failed by multiple social service systems and that his youth and potential for rehabilitation should be considered as mitigating factors, even if he were found guilty of the charges against him. However, these arguments faced significant obstacles. Lovette's extensive juvenile criminal record made it difficult to portray him as someone who had simply made youthful mistakes, rather than someone who had made deliberate choices to engage in increasingly serious criminal behavior. The systematic nature of Eve's murder and the evidence of premeditation made it hard to argue that this was an impulsive act by someone too young to understand the consequences of his actions. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. They presented the DNA evidence that placed Lovett inside Eve's car during the time she was being held captive. They showed surveillance footage that captured him using her ATM card to withdraw money from her accounts. They presented cell phone records that tracked his movements throughout Chapel Hill during the crucial hours when the crime was being committed. Perhaps most damaging to Lovett's defense was Atwater's detailed testimony about the crime. Speaking as part of his plea agreement, Atwater provided an hour-by-hour account of how they had selected Eve as their target, forced their way into her home, kidnapped her, and ultimately killed her. His testimony was specific, internally consistent, and corroborated by the physical evidence that investigators had collected. Atwater's description of Lovett's role in the crime painted him as the primary aggressor who had initiated the attack on Eve's home, and who had been most actively involved in the violence that followed. According to Atwater's testimony, Lovett had been the one who first suggested targeting university students, had been the one who noticed Eve through her window, and had been the most enthusiastic about escalating from robbery to murder. The testimony about Eve's final moments was particularly powerful and disturbing. Atwater described how she had pleaded for her life, had offered to give them whatever money she had, and had promised never to report the crime if they would let her go. He testified that when Eve asked them to pray with her, Lovett had responded by shooting her multiple times, showing no mercy or hesitation about ending her life. The defense team, as cross-examination of Atwater, focused on the benefits he had received for his cooperation and the possibility that he was exaggerating Lovett's role in the crime to minimize his own responsibility. They pointed out that Atwater had avoided the death penalty by agreeing to testify and suggested that his testimony might be tailored to tell prosecutors what they wanted to hear rather than providing an accurate account of what had actually happened. Atwater's testimony was supported by so much independent evidence that it was difficult for the defense to challenge its fundamental accuracy. Even if some details were questionable or self-serving, the basic facts of the case were established by surveillance footage, DNA evidence, and financial records that could not be explained away. The trial also included testimony from forensic experts who explained the DNA evidence, law enforcement officers who described the investigation, and university officials who testified about Eve's character and the impact her death had had on the campus community. Each element of the prosecution's case reinforced the others, creating a comprehensive picture of guilt that left little room for reasonable doubt. After several days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, and firearms violations. The conviction meant that Lovett would face the possibility of life imprisonment without parole, though his age at the time of the crime precluded the death penalty under North Carolina law. During the penalty phase of the trial, the defense team presented evidence about Lovett's troubled childhood, his exposure to violence and poverty, and the failures of various social service systems to provide him with appropriate intervention and support. They argued that these circumstances, combined with his youth, warranted a sentence that would allow for the possibility of eventual rehabilitation and release. The prosecution countered by emphasizing the premeditated nature of the crime, the suffering that Eve had endured, and the need to protect society from someone who had demonstrated such a capacity for violence. They argued that Lovett had been given multiple opportunities to change his behavior through previous encounters with the juvenile justice system, and had consistently chosen to escalate his criminal activity instead. Judge Carl Fox ultimately sentenced Lovett to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a decision that reflected both the seriousness of his crimes and the legal constraints on punishing juvenile offenders. The sentence ensured that Lovett would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent victims, while acknowledging the complex legal and ethical issues surrounding the prosecution of minors for adult crimes. However, Lovett's legal saga was far from over. In 2013, his conviction was overturned by the North Carolina Court of Appeals based on a separate ruling that had declared life sentences without parole for juvenile offenders to be unconstitutional. This decision reflected evolving legal and social attitudes about juvenile punishment and rehabilitation, particularly influenced by recent Supreme Court rulings that had placed new limitations on the sentences that could be imposed on offenders who committed their crimes while still minors. The appellate court's ruling meant that Lovett would receive a new trial, with the possibility that he might ultimately receive a sentence that would allow for eventual parole consideration. This development was devastating for Eve's family and the university community, who had hoped that the original conviction and sentencing would provide final closure to the case. The new trial, conducted in 2014, followed many of the same patterns as the original proceedings. The evidence against Lovett remained overwhelming, and Atwater again testified about the details of the crime under his plea agreement. However, Lovett was more vocal during the second trial, making statements to the court about his youth at the time of the crime and his belief that everyone deserved opportunities for redemption and rehabilitation. Despite these appeals for leniency, Lovett showed little genuine remorse for his crimes. His statements to the court focused more on his own circumstances than on the harm he had caused to Eve and her family. This lack of authentic accountability reinforced the prosecution's arguments that he remained a danger to society and should receive the maximum sentence allowed under the revised legal standards. Judge Fox again sentenced Lovett to life imprisonment, though under the new legal framework. This sentence would allow for the possibility of parole consideration after many decades of incarceration, while Lovett would likely spend most or all of his natural life in prison. There was now a theoretical possibility that he might eventually be released if he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation, and if parole boards determined that he no longer posed a threat to public safety. The legal resolution of Eve Carson's murder case provided a measure of justice for her family and the university community, but it also highlighted ongoing debates about appropriate punishment for juvenile offenders, the goals of the criminal justice system, and the balance between rehabilitation and public safety. The case would continue to influence discussions about these issues for years to come, serving as a reference point for other cases involving young offenders who committed serious adult crimes. More importantly, the case would serve as a catalyst for meaningful changes in campus safety policies, criminal justice procedures, and legislative responses to violent crime. Eve's death had exposed vulnerabilities in systems that were supposed to protect young people, and her legacy would include efforts to strengthen these protections and prevent similar tragedies in the future. The resolution of the criminal cases against Demario Atwater and Lawrence Lovett marked the end of a legal process that had consumed years of resources and emotional energy from Eve Carson's family, the University of North Carolina community, and the broader public. But the impact of Eve's murder extended far beyond the courtroom, catalyzing changes in policy law and social attitudes that would shape how similar cases were handled in the future, and how communities approach the complex challenges of preventing violent crime while supporting rehabilitation and redemption. The immediate aftermath of Eve's murder had sent shockwaves through the University of North Carolina campus and the broader Chapel Hill community. For decades, the area had been viewed as one of the safest college towns in America, a place where students could focus on their studies and personal development without worrying about violent crime. The random nature of Eve's murder shattered these assumptions and forced everyone to reconsider their basic assumptions about personal safety and security. The university's response was swift and comprehensive. Campus security protocols were immediately reviewed and strengthened, with increased patrols in off-campus residential areas where many students lived. The university expanded its emergency notification systems, improved lighting in parking areas and walking paths, and enhanced coordination with local law enforcement agencies to ensure better communication about potential threats to student safety. But perhaps most significantly, the university began a thorough examination of its responsibilities to students who lived off campus. While the institution had always focused its security efforts on dormitories, academic buildings, and other facilities under direct university control, Eve's murder demonstrated that students remained part of the university community even when they lived in private housing beyond the campus boundaries. This recognition led to expanded safety education programs that taught students about personal security measures, situational awareness, and risk reduction strategies. The university also developed new partnerships with local landlords and property management companies to improve security features in off-campus housing, including better locks, improved lighting, and enhanced communication systems for reporting suspicious activity. The case also had a profound impact on criminal justice policy in North Carolina and beyond. The systematic failures that had allowed both Atwater and Lovett to remain free despite their extensive criminal histories highlighted serious flaws in how the state handled repeat offenders and managed individuals who were cycling through the justice system without receiving appropriate interventions. In February 2009, North Carolina legislators responded by enacting comprehensive criminal justice reform legislation that was directly inspired by Eve's murder. The new law, which took effect on December 1st of that year, introduced significantly harsher penalties for individuals involved in gang-related offenses and established more rigorous procedures for managing repeat offenders who had demonstrated escalating patterns of criminal behavior. The legislation also addressed some of the systemic issues that had contributed to the crime. It required more thorough background checks for early release programs, established new standards for supervising individuals on probation, and created better information sharing systems between different law enforcement agencies and court systems. These changes were designed to prevent cases like Atwater and Lovett from slipping through cracks in the system and continuing to pose threats to public safety. The law also included provisions specifically related to crimes against college students, recognizing that university communities represented distinct populations that might require specialized protection strategies. These provisions encouraged better cooperation between campus security forces and local law enforcement agencies, and established new protocols for investigating crimes that occurred in the transitional areas between campus property and surrounding residential neighborhoods. However, the legislative response to Eve's murder also sparked broader debates about the effectiveness of punitive approaches to crime prevention versus investment in social programs, education, and community development that might address the root causes of criminal behavior. Critics argued that simply increasing penalties for violent crimes would do little to prevent future tragedies if the underlying social and economic factors that contributed to criminal behavior remained unaddressed. These debates reflected long-standing tensions in American criminal justice policy between approaches that emphasized punishment and deterrence and those that focused on rehabilitation and prevention. Eve's case provided compelling arguments for both perspectives. The senseless nature of her murder suggested that some individuals might be beyond rehabilitation and needed to be permanently removed from society, while the troubled backgrounds of her killers suggested that earlier interventions might have prevented their escalation to murder. The case also influenced national discussions about juvenile justice policy, particularly regarding the appropriate punishment for minors who commit serious adult crimes. Lawrence Lovett's age at the time of the murder had complicated his prosecution and sentencing, raising questions about whether traditional juvenile justice approaches were adequate for addressing the most serious, violent offenses committed by young people. The eventual overturning of Lovett's original sentence by the Court of Appeals reflected evolving legal standards regarding juvenile punishment that had been influenced by recent Supreme Court decisions. These legal developments suggested a national trend toward recognizing the developmental differences between adolescents and adults and adjusting criminal justice responses accordingly, even for the most serious crimes. However, these legal changes were controversial in cases like Eve's murder, where the brutality and premeditation of the crime seemed to transcend typical considerations about youthful indiscretion or immaturity. The case highlighted the challenges that courts faced in balancing scientific understanding about adolescent brain development with public demands for appropriate punishment for heinous crimes beyond its impact on policy and law. Eve's murder also had profound personal consequences for everyone who had known her, and for the broader university community that had come to see her as a symbol of the positive change that dedicated young people could create in the world. The loss of her potential contributions to society, her planned career in public service, Her commitment to addressing global health challenges, her leadership abilities that had already made such an impact on campus, represented a tragedy that extended far beyond her immediate family and friends. The university's response to this loss included the establishment of several memorial initiatives designed to preserve Eve's memory and continue the work she had been passionate about. The Eve Carson Memorial Scholarship was created to support students who demonstrated her commitment to public service and academic excellence. The scholarship was funded through donations from alumni, faculty, community members, and organizations that had been inspired by Eve's story and wanted to ensure that her values would continue to influence future generations of students. The memorial garden created on campus became a place of reflection and remembrance, designed not just as a tribute to Eve, but as a space where students could contemplate the responsibilities that come with education and privilege. The garden included native plants from North Carolina and Georgia, representing her connections to both states, and featured inscriptions of quotes from Eve's writings and speeches that captured her philosophy about service, leadership, and making a positive difference in the world. These physical memorials were accompanied by changes in campus culture that reflected a deeper understanding of the fragility of life and the importance of looking out for one another. Students became more conscious of personal safety measures, more willing to intervene when they observed potentially dangerous situations, and more committed to building a community where everyone felt responsible for everyone else's well-being. The ripple effects of Eve's murder extended into popular culture and media representations of campus safety. Her case became a reference point for discussions about violence against college students, the vulnerability of young people living independently for the first time, and the challenges that universities faced in protecting students while preserving the freedom and independence that were essential parts of the college experience. True crime documentaries, news magazine programs, and investigative journalism pieces examined the case in detail, not just as a criminal story, but as a lens for understanding broader social issues. These media treatments helped keep Eve's memory alive, while also educating the public about the realities of random violence and the importance of community vigilance in preventing such crimes. One of the most poignant connections between Eve's legacy and popular culture emerged in February 2009, when one of her close friends, Anoop Desai, became a finalist on the television show American Idol. During his appearances on the program, Desai spoke movingly about how Eve's death had motivated him to pursue his dreams with greater urgency and determination. He explained that Eve had always encouraged him to audition for the show, believing in his talent and potential even when he doubted himself. Desai's success on American Idol brought national attention to Eve's story and provided a platform for discussing her impact on the people who had known her. His performances often included dedications to her memory, and his interviews frequently mentioned how her death had taught him not to postpone pursuing the things that mattered most to him. Without Eve's encouragement and the lesson of how quickly life could be cut short, he said, he never would have found the courage to audition for the show. This connection between Eve's death and Desai's artistic success illustrated one of the complex ways that tragedy can sometimes inspire positive action and meaningful achievement. While nothing could justify or compensate for the loss of Eve's life, the fact that her memory continued to motivate others to pursue their dreams and make positive contributions to society provided some measure of comfort to those who mourned her loss. The case also influenced academic research and scholarly discussions about campus safety, criminal justice policy, and the social factors that contribute to violent crime. Criminologists and social scientists studied the case as an example of how random violence intersects with institutional responses, community resilience, and policy development. These academic examinations helped identify best practices for preventing similar crimes and responding effectively when prevention fails. Research institutions began developing new approaches to understanding and preventing violence against college students, drawing on lessons learned from Eve's case and similar incidents. These efforts included studies of environmental design factors that could reduce vulnerability, to crime analysis of communication systems that could improve emergency response times, and evaluation of educational programs designed to improve personal safety awareness without creating unnecessary fear or paranoia. The psychological impact of Eve's murder on her family, friends, and the broader community also became a subject of study and intervention. Mental health professionals worked to understand how communities process and recover from random violent crimes. particularly when the victims are young people who represent hope and potential for the future. These studies help develop better support services for people affected by similar tragedies and improved protocols for helping communities heal from traumatic events. For Eve's parents, Anne Marie and Thomas Carson, the years following their daughter's murder involved not only grieving their loss, but also working to ensure that her death would lead to meaningful changes that might prevent other families from experiencing similar devastation. They became advocates for campus safety improvements, criminal justice reform, and victims' rights initiatives that reflected lessons learned from their daughter's case. Their advocacy work included speaking to university administrators about safety protocols, testifying before legislative committees about criminal justice policy, and working with other families who had lost children to violent crime. Their efforts were motivated not by a desire for revenge or punishment, but by a commitment to honoring Eve's memory through work that could make the world safer and more just. The Carsons also worked to preserve the authentic memory of their daughter, ensuring that she was remembered not just as a victim of violent crime, but as a complete person who had accomplished remarkable things in her short life and who had inspired others to pursue excellence in service. They shared stories about her childhood, her academic achievements, her international experiences, and her plans for the future, painting a picture of a young woman whose life had meaning and value that extended far beyond the tragic circumstances of her death. This effort to preserve Eve's complete legacy was important for several reasons. It provided a more accurate and inspiring narrative for people who wanted to honor her memory through their own actions and choices. It also helped counter the tendency for victims of violent crime to be defined primarily by their deaths rather than by their lives, ensuring that Eve would be remembered for her contributions and potential rather than just for the tragedy that ended her life. As the years passed, the immediate shock and fear generated by Eve's murder began to fade, but the changes it had catalyzed continued to evolve and expand. Campus safety protocols that had been implemented in response to her death became standard practices that protected countless other students. Criminal justice reforms, inspired by her case, helped prevent other repeat offenders from escalating to murder. Legislative changes, sparked by the community's demand for action, created new protections that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of her death. Perhaps most importantly, the memory of Eve Carson continued to inspire young people to pursue lives of service, academic excellence, and commitment to making positive changes in their communities. The scholarship recipients who benefited from the memorial fund established in her name carried forward her values and aspirations, creating a multiplying effect that ensured her influence would continue to grow rather than diminish over time. The case also served as a reminder of the importance of community vigilance and mutual responsibility in maintaining safe environments. The investigation had been successful, partly because community members had come forward with tips and information that helped identify the perpetrators. This cooperation between law enforcement and the public had been crucial in achieving justice, and it provided a model for how communities could work together to prevent and respond to violent crime. In the end, the story of Eve Carson's murder became more than just a criminal case or a tragedy. It became a catalyst for a positive change that honored her memory while protecting others from similar fates. The legislative reforms, policy changes, safety improvements, and cultural shifts that resulted from her death created a legacy that was worthy of the remarkable young woman whose life had been cut so tragically short. The investigation, techniques, and legal precedents established during the case also contributed to improvements in how similar crimes were handled in the future. The use of surveillance footage, cell phone data, and financial records to construct detailed timelines became standard practices that helped solve other cases. The coordination between different law enforcement agencies and the integration of various types of evidence provided a template for handling complex criminal investigations that involved multiple suspects and crime scenes. These procedural improvements meant that Eve's death contributed not just to preventing future crimes, but also to ensuring that when violent crimes did occur, they were more likely to be solved quickly and the perpetrators brought to justice. The investigative methods refined during her case helped other families achieve closure and held other criminals accountable for their actions, extending the positive impact of the work done by the detectives and prosecutors who had pursued her killers. More than a decade after Eve Carson's murder, her story continues to resonate with people who never met her, but who have been inspired by her example and motivated by the tragedy of her death to work for a safer, more just society. Her legacy lives on in the students who receive scholarships in her name, the policies that protect other young people from violence, the laws that hold repeat offenders accountable for their crimes, and the countless individual decisions to pursue lives of service and excellence that have been inspired by her memory. The case remains a powerful reminder that even the most senseless tragedies can sometimes catalyze meaningful change, and that the memory of good people who are taken too soon can continue to influence the world in positive ways long after their deaths. Eve Carson's life was cut short at age 22, but her impact on the world has continued to grow, touching the lives of people she never met and contributing to changes that will protect and inspire future generations. In the landscape of American true crime stories, few cases have generated the combination of horror, inspiration, and meaningful reform that emerged from the murder of Eve Carson. Her story serves as both a chilling reminder of the random nature of violent crime and a powerful example of how communities can respond to tragedy by working to prevent similar losses in the future. It demonstrates the importance of remembering victims as complete human beings rather than just tragic figures, and it shows how the memory of someone who lived with purpose and dedication can continue to make the world better even after their death.